The date is June 14, 1940. The location is Paris, France. The atmosphere is thick, not with celebration, but with a smothering, agonizing silence. Just hours earlier, the Wehrmacht had rolled in. The speed of the German advance, the infamous Blitzkrieg, had stunned the world, collapsing the great French army in barely 6 weeks. Now the symbols of that conquest, tanks, marching boots, and the incessant roar of diesel engines, filled the Avenue des Champs-Élysées. It was a victory parade, meticulously staged, designed not just to assert military dominance but to crush the very spirit of the conquered nation. This parade was more than a display of steel. It was a psychological weapon. Its true objective was to elicit a response from the Parisian crowd. The Nazis expected awe, fear, or perhaps grudging respect. Most critically, they demanded conformity. The universal gesture of allegiance, the outstretched arm of the Hitler salute, was the simplest proof of submission. A salute was a contract. It said, "We accept your rule." But as the columns of immaculate German soldiers, their uniforms crisp and their steps synchronized, past the famous café terraces, something profoundly unsettling began to happen. The crowd was immense, pressed against the barriers, yet their movement was minimal. Their hands remained firmly in their pockets, gripping handbags or held loosely at their sides. The air was heavy, charged with an invisible pressure. The Germans, initially confident, began to notice. A single individual refusing to salute might be dismissed as an anomaly or a dissident. But hundreds, then thousands standing motionless, their gazes fixed and cold, created a vast collective statement of rejection. This was not chaos. It was a perfect, chilling order of refusal. Historians often focus on the grand battles, the fall of cities, the clash of armies. But here, on the pavement of a defeated capital, was a battle of wills, a silent moral confrontation where the weapons were dignity and defiance. The Germans, masters of physical warfare, were suddenly facing an enemy they couldn't bomb, couldn't machine gun, and couldn't easily arrest: massed indifference. The Nazi leadership had underestimated the French spirit, ironically viewing them through a simplistic propaganda lens as weak and decadent. They believed the humiliation of defeat would break them entirely, forcing a psychological surrender. What they failed to grasp was the depth of the cultural pride and the immediate visceral insult that the demand for the forced salute represented. For a Frenchman, the act of raising one's hand to honor the conqueror, the very force that had shattered their nation, was not merely a political act. It was an act of profound self-betrayal. It was the surrendering of one's history, one's freedom, and one's very identity. It was too high a price for safety. "We had lost the war of the armies," one Parisian later recalled, "but the war of the soul? That had just begun, and they would not win it on the streets of Paris." This quiet resistance would become a signature of the 4-year occupation. It was an initial tremor in the foundation of the Germans' meticulously constructed occupation reality, a reality where every rule had a corresponding punishment, yet where the greatest, most widespread defiance was the one they could not easily codify or control: the refusal to move a muscle. This initial silent refusal sets the stage for the escalating psychological and physical conflict to come, turning the streets of France into a theater of everyday espionage and moral reckoning. The dramatic irony here is palpable. The victors, marching in triumph, were utterly powerless against the sheer, overwhelming weight of the losers' silence. They had captured the territory, but they had utterly failed to capture the hearts. And in a war ultimately decided by morale and political will, this failure was a subtle, deadly wound. If you find this deep dive into the hidden battles of history compelling, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. Your support helps us uncover the stories of those who dared to defy the tide. The refusal to salute was an immediate, spontaneous human reaction, but the German administration, driven by its bureaucratic obsession with order, quickly moved to formalize their demand for submission. This wasn't just about parades, it was about the normalization of conquest. The technical term for what the Nazis desired was not simply recognition, but psychological domination. They understood that true control is not maintained by the constant presence of a rifle, but by the internal submission of the populace. A compulsory salute, repeated dozens of times a day, was a constant small reminder of inferiority, designed to break down self-respect one gesture at a time. It was a technique of total submission. Within weeks of the occupation, directives were issued from the Oberfeldkommandantur, the German military command in France. While often cloaked in the language of respect for the occupying forces and maintaining public order, the underlying intent was clear. French civilians were expected to acknowledge the authority of German officers and officials, a requirement often interpreted by patrolmen as demanding the salute. The German system used a gradient of coercion, a subtle strategic progression. Phase 1. The stare. Initial encounters focused on aggressive eye contact. A German soldier passing a civilian would fix them with a hard stare, waiting for a flinch or a gesture of deference. The French response was the fixed indifference, a stare that looked through rather than at the soldier. Phase 2. The interrogation. If the stare failed, the soldier would often stop, demanding identification and asking the civilian, in poor French or curt German, "Warum grüßen Sie nicht?" Why do you not salute? This was not about finding a legal infraction. It was about injecting fear and inconvenience into the act of defiance. Phase 3. The escalation. This is where the true terror lay. Refusal could lead to arbitrary arrest, a beating, or, in the worst cases, detention and forced labor. The uncertainty of the penalty was the actual tool of compliance. Engineers and urban planners within the French resistance developed their own counter-tactics to this psychological warfare. They were not fighting tanks, but fighting the gaze of the occupier. One common, almost theatrical technique was the simultaneous distraction. As a patrol approached, a civilian might dramatically drop a bag of groceries, forcing them to bend down at the precise moment the salute would have been due. Another was the sudden, intense interest in a shop window, leaning close to the glass, making a salute physically awkward and obviously insincere. These small acts of civilian espionage became a form of low-grade, perpetual resistance. Every refusal, every averted gaze, every hand kept firmly down was a tiny, invisible pinprick against the facade of Nazi invincibility. It was the collective weight of these moments that prevented the psychological conquest. The irony for the German High Command was that their technical precision, the very characteristic they prided themselves on, failed them here. They could meticulously calculate the firing range of an 88mm gun, but they could not calculate the breaking point of a nation's pride. They were fighting an emotional calculus they simply did not possess. As a high-ranking officer in Paris noted in a private letter to Berlin expressing frustration, "The Parisians, they do not fight us with rifles. They fight us with their faces. They have erected a wall of pure, frozen contempt that is more difficult to breach than a steel barricade." The French were treating the occupiers not as rulers, but as an unpleasant temporary weather condition, something to be endured and ignored until it passed. This deliberate, unified detachment was the most potent technological countermeasure to the Nazi edict of obedience. The German occupation machine was built on the premise of visible superiority. Their strategy was fundamentally cinematic: massive flags, perfectly marching columns, the ubiquitous presence of the swastika banner draped over historical monuments. This was the architecture of humiliation, designed to enforce the narrative that the French spirit was broken and the new order was permanent. However, the French, a nation with an ancient tradition of political theater and sophisticated visual arts, were masters of counterwill through subtle subversion. The Nazi propaganda machine, under the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, quickly noticed the failure of the forced salute. Their response was to escalate the visual war. Posters plastered across French cities began to emphasize Franco-German cooperation, showing happy French workers or shared industrial projects. These visuals were an attempt to create the impression of public consent, hoping the populace would begin to mimic the visual lie. But the resistance did not challenge the visuals directly. They undermined them. Consider the case of the gendarme, French policeman, forced to patrol alongside German military police. He could not openly resist, but he could perform the most minimal gesture of compliance. When an order was barked, the French officer would often execute the most sluggish, begrudging salute imaginable. A hand moving just slowly enough, the palm positioned just awkwardly enough to convey disrespect without risking direct insubordination. This was known as Le salut de tortue, the tortoise salute. This passive aggression was mirrored by the civilians. Since they could not openly refuse to acknowledge a German officer, they developed a tactical response known as the object shield. They would walk with a baguette held vertically, or an umbrella held horizontally, or a newspaper opened wide, forcing them to maneuver the item at the precise moment of passing. The salute was technically impossible, or would look ridiculous, providing an instant plausible deniability. My apologies, Herr Offizier, my hands were full. Another widespread, entirely non-political technique was the coughing fit. As the German column approached, entire streets of people would suddenly be gripped by simultaneous violent coughing, requiring both hands to cover their mouths or hold themselves upright. These acts were more than simple defiance. They were tactical innovations born of necessity. The Germans, with their rigid, rule-bound mindset, could not arrest someone for carrying a loaf of bread or having a cough. The rules of engagement had been subtly shifted, turning the ordinary French street into a minefield of social codes the Germans did not understand. The irony here is deep. The French, renowned for their manners and politeness, used the very structure of their civility to resist. Their refusal was cloaked in the language of accident, inconvenience, and the necessities of daily life. The strategic consequence was devastating to German morale and authority. The German soldier needed to believe that his mission was righteous and his conquest accepted. When confronted daily by a sea of stone-faced citizens manipulating bread and umbrellas to avoid acknowledging his existence, the glorious image of the conqueror began to erode. He was not a liberator or a hero. He was simply an obstacle to be bypassed with a carefully timed cough. This quiet subversion became the first, most pervasive layer of the French resistance. For the occupying German soldier, the daily expectation of the salute created a unique and ultimately destructive psychological burden. The rigid protocol, meant to instill confidence and authority, instead became a measuring stick for their own failure to be accepted. Consider the typical German patrolman, often a young man separated from the exhilaration of the front lines, assigned to the monotonous grey work of occupation. His military manual specified the proper conduct: maintain order, enforce curfews, and above all, command respect. The salute was the simplest, most visible metric of that command. It was the daily validation of the Führerprinzip, the leadership principle, manifested on a foreign pavement. When the French refused to salute, the patrolman faced a constant micro-level dilemma: to enforce or to ignore. The internal pressure was immense. German military command operated on a principle of absolute adherence to ideological and procedural norms. Reports from occupied zones were scrutinized in Berlin not just for security, but for evidence of the population's attitude toward the Reich. A wave of non-salutes indicated that the ideological conquest was failing, and the local garrison commander would face censure. If the soldier ignored it, he risked the ire of his superiors, who monitored the respect shown by the population with almost obsessive bureaucratic detail. More damagingly, he internally acknowledged his own lack of authority. The Herrenvolk, the master race, was being visually dismissed by the conquered. This daily rejection eroded the very foundation of their ideological superiority. A private diary entry from a soldier in the Feldgendarmerie in Nantes complained, "We wear the uniform that crushed Europe, and they look at us as if we were street cleaners. Every unmoved hand is a challenge to the entire Reich." If he enforced it, he had to stop, engage, and potentially arrest a civilian, a process that required paperwork, time, and often escalated into a noisy scene, drawing further unwelcome attention from the silent, observing crowd. It turned a simple street passage into a stressful administrative chore. The required German arrest procedure mandated multiple witnesses and detailed logging of the offense, a bureaucratic nightmare for a simple moment of civilian disrespect. A German soldier could easily spend half his shift processing one defiant baker, leaving the rest of the street ungoverned and mocking. This constant low-grade friction led to a phenomenon described by historians and psychologists who studied occupation forces as occupation burnout. The psychological energy required to maintain the facade of effortless superiority against a populace determined to deny it was immense. The French had devised a strategy that maximized inconvenience and minimized risk. The Wehrmacht had deployed approximately 5 million soldiers to France in 1940. By 1942, that number stabilized around 600,000 to 700,000 for occupation duties. Yet these hundreds of thousands of men were forced into daily exhausting psychological skirmishes with a population of over 40 million. The ratio of mental effort to effective control was catastrophically unfavorable to the Germans. Testimonies from German soldiers stationed in Paris reveal this strain. One private wrote home, "The French do not look at us. They look past us, as if we are ghosts." It is worse than being shouted at. It is a slow suffocation of the ego. This feeling of being rendered invisible, of having their immense power acknowledged only by the visible, tangible acts of French collaborators, hollowed out the German sense of victory. The ultimate irony lies in the principle of diminishing returns. The more the Nazis insisted on the salute, the more the French refined their techniques of evasion. The pressure generated an equal and opposite counter-pressure, demonstrating a clear technological advantage of human ingenuity over rigid military code. The French had effectively weaponized their own passivity and the very logistics of civilian life. The slow walker. This was not random slowness, but a tactic often organized by local resistance cells operating on the neighborhood level. A civilian would begin walking at an incredibly slow pace just ahead of a German officer, forcing the officer to either rudely push past, a violation of their own internal code of military discipline, or slow down to the pace of the obstructionist. If the officer passed, the opportunity for a salute was gone. The average urban patrol moved at a pace of roughly 3 kilometers per hour. The slow walker could reduce this pace by half, creating a tactical traffic jam of defiance. The invisible group. Small groups of civilians would walk with their heads down, engaging in intense whispered conversation, creating a self-contained world of engagement that completely excluded the German presence. They were too busy, too preoccupied with their own affairs. A child's illness, a forgotten errand, a dramatic retelling of a mundane event, to notice the passing conqueror. Their lack of visual acknowledgement was a meticulously crafted psychological shield. The Nazis understood industrial scale. They understood the terrifying logistics of the Blitzkrieg, which could deploy 50 divisions across France, but they did not understand the profound tactical power of a massed, non-violent psychological strike. Their entire ideological structure was based on the premise that the conquered would naturally defer to the stronger will. The fact that the French were using mundane objects and slow walking to negate their authority was a daily, unbearable affront to the Nazi concept of racial and military supremacy. The psychological cost of the forced salute insult was not primarily borne by the French, who gained internal strength from their defiance, but by the German occupation forces, whose sense of righteous power was slowly, deliberately eroded by a simple, quiet no. This was the occupation's greatest, most invisible battleground. While the majority of defiance was executed through subtle evasion and coded tactics, there were moments of outright open refusal that cemented the narrative of resistance and inspired the community. These were the heroes of the café terraces, ordinary individuals who in a single exposed gesture turned a simple refusal into a powerful public declaration. These moments were critical because they transformed an individual secret act of evasion into a collective visible validation of the counter-will. They served as a necessary corrective to the daily psychological attrition, proving that the enemy could be momentarily defeated with nothing more than courage and wit. The most powerful examples often occurred in high-visibility locations, such as the open-air cafés of Lyon or Marseille, strategically chosen as public theatres of engagement. Here a refusal would be witnessed by dozens of French citizens and several German patrols. The stakes were immediate and severe, ranging from a savage beating to immediate arrest and deportation. The risk was calculable, but the resulting moral uplift was immeasurable. One documented case from Lyon involved Madame Dubois, a pseudonym used in resistance accounts, a middle-aged woman known for her quiet dignity who ran a small seamstress shop. A group of SS officers, the black-uniformed, most feared arm of the German forces, passed her table. By convention, all nearby civilians were expected to rise and offer the salute. Madame Dubois remained seated, calmly sipping her coffee, her expression impassive. When an SS officer stopped and demanded in fluent but harsh French why she had failed to show the proper respect, her reply was calm, devastating, and delivered for all to hear, cutting through the silence like glass. "Monsieur, I am merely resting my arm. It has been a very long day of carrying the burden of France." This was not simply a refusal, it was a verbal strike, a challenge to the moral legitimacy of the occupation itself. It weaponized the soldier's own ideology against him, painting the Reich as a tedious, heavy burden rather than a glorious conqueror. The German officer, caught in a public spectacle, faced a tactical dilemma that was immediately broadcast to the observing crowd. To violently arrest an elderly woman in full view of the public would expose the sheer, fragile brutality behind the occupation's facade and turn her into an immediate martyr. To let her go would be an unbearable loss of face in front of both his men and the civilians. He chose a middle path, confiscating her identification and threatening deportation, but the damage was done. The other patrons, who had held their breath for perhaps 30 agonizing seconds, let out a collective silent sigh, a shared moment of victory that reinforced their own inner resolve. These isolated acts of courage provided a catalyst for massed resistance. They showed the populace that open defiance was possible, provided it was delivered with wit, composure, and a profound sense of moral certainty. Statistical analysis of underground activity suggests that in the 2 weeks following a widely circulated anecdote of open defiance, the volume of anti-German graffiti and pamphlet distribution in the local area often surged by up to 40%. Furthermore, the resistance groups, specifically the Francs-Tireurs and the Mouvement de Libération Nationale, understood the value of this street-level theatre. The press was controlled by the Nazis, so they had to invent their own media. They began to circulate pamphlets, tiny folded pieces of paper, some only 5 centimeters by 10 centimeters, slipped under doors or left in phone booths, that celebrated these acts. These stories were often given poetic names: the stare of the Rue Saint-Honoré, or the unbowed hand of the Canebière. The technology of the printed word, operating underground, transformed the personal risk of an individual into the shared legend of the nation. It turned the forced salute insult from a Nazi demand into the French litmus test of resistance. Every civilian knew the unspoken moral question: did you salute today? The collective negative answer, confirmed by the underground literature, sustained the moral fabric of the nation throughout the darkest days of the war. These small gestures, repeated millions of times over the 4 years of occupation, were the industrial production of hope, proving that technological mastery could not conquer human dignity. The continued, pervasive refusal to salute eventually drove the German command to a brutal, more direct form of retaliation. The psychological tactic of subtle coercion had utterly failed. The time for outright terror had arrived. This strategic shift signaled the Nazi regime's admission that their ideological program had collapsed in the face of French resilience. The German strategy marked a crucial pivot point. They realized that controlling the body was easier than controlling the mind. Since they could not legislate pride or outlaw indifference, they began to introduce disproportionate penalties for minor transgressions. This was the moment the hidden battle moved from the café terrace to the prison cell. The blacklist technique, local Gestapo, secret state police, and Sicherheitspolizei, security police units, began compiling blacklists of known defiant individuals. These were often people who had been detained for insolence during a refusal to salute, or were observed to be leaders in the silent resistance on their local streets. These lists were sophisticated, utilizing card filing systems and cross-referenced addresses, a chilling application of German bureaucratic efficiency to personal defiance. The penalties became a calculated gradient of humiliation and pain. The penalty for an initial failure to salute might be a fine often set exorbitantly high, around 500 to 1,000 francs, a sum equivalent to a week or more of a working man's wages. The penalty for a second failure, or being caught performing a tortoise salute, often became the mandatory cleaning of German barracks or latrines, a public and profoundly humiliating form of forced labor, designed to break the individual's sense of self-worth by forcing them into the role of the ultimate subordinate. The penalty for an accumulation of these insults, especially after being placed on the blacklist, was arbitrary arrest, followed by interrogation and eventual detention in infamous centres like the Fresnes prison near Paris or the fortress at Montluc in Lyon. Tens of thousands of French citizens passed through these internal prisons, many for crimes no greater than a disrespectful look or a slow step. The technology of terror was refined. The German police used collective punishment to enforce individual compliance. If, for example, the residents of a specific block of apartments were noted for their persistent lack of respect toward a passing officer, perhaps 15 incidents logged in a week, the entire building might face a mandatory 24-hour curfew, cutting off access to food and medicine. The goal was to turn neighbor against neighbor, making the community enforce the rule the Germans themselves could not. This escalation led to a tragic irony. The French, who had initially refused the salute as an act of personal honor, now had to weigh their personal honor against the immediate, tangible suffering of their neighbors. "The day they took my grocer because he walked too slowly past a parade, I understood," recalled a witness from Bordeaux. "It was no longer just about me. My non-salute was not a badge of courage. It was a potential sentence for the innocent." That is when the resistance had to go deeper underground, trading the visible insult for the secret sabotage. This forced calculation led to a brief period where some French citizens did execute a superficial minimal salute when directly confronted by an armed German patrol. This was not surrender. It was a strategic retreat. It was the equivalent of a military force temporarily yielding terrain to save the lives of its troops and regroup for a more damaging long-term fight. The battle was no longer on the sidewalk. It was now in the railway yards, the communication lines, and the industrial centers, where the resistance began to inflict genuine material damage on the German war machine. The ultimate failure of the German strategy lay in their inability to accept this cosmetic compliance. They demanded not the movement of an arm, but the submission of the heart. Because they could not read the hearts of the French people, they were perpetually dissatisfied, forever pushing their methods of coercion until they reached the point of open atrocity, the very point that historically ensures the eventual defeat of the occupier. The refusal to salute had forced the mighty Wehrmacht to reveal the ugly, terrifying face beneath the veneer of military order, a fatal flaw that solidified French resolve. The refusal to salute was the first and most enduring, non-violent campaign of the French resistance, a moral precursor to the military and industrial sabotage that followed. Its legacy is etched not in battle records, but in the psychological archives of the war, a silent monument to dignity. By August 1944, 4 years after the silence began, the consequences of that initial collective refusal were finally being tallied. The refusal to raise a hand 4 years prior had denied the Germans the psychological victory they craved, setting the stage for their material defeat. The German occupation had collapsed under the weight of Allied invasion and sustained internal resistance. As the last German convoys desperately attempted to evacuate Paris, the scene was a chilling mirror image of the triumphal march of 1940, but with a profound twist. This time, the German soldiers did not expect a salute. They expected vengeance. Their columns moved not with synchronized pride, but with the hurried, ragged desperation of retreat, harassed by fighters of the Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur, FFI, and despised by the crowds. There were no civilians dropping groceries. There was only open scorn and, in some places, gunfire. The final, powerful irony of the narrative unfolded on August 25, 1944, during the iconic victory parade led by General Charles de Gaulle on the Avenue des Champs-Élysées. The atmosphere was electric, a magnificent cacophony of joy replacing the smothering silence of 1940. Hundreds of thousands of Parisians, who had stood motionless just 4 years earlier, lined the avenue. This time the French people raised their hands, but not to salute a conqueror. They raised them to wave at their liberators, their hands moving freely, divorced from the constraint of terror. They were celebrating the reclamation of a simple, fundamental right, the freedom to choose one's own gesture. The meaning of the non-salute was finally revealed. It was never merely a refusal to acknowledge the Nazis. It was a profound affirmation of self-ownership. They had refused to let the enemy co-opt their hands, their bodies, or their minds. The French had instinctively understood the nature of true power. It resides not in the size of the army, but in the consent of the governed. The forced salute insult had failed because the German administration treated the human spirit as a machine to be commanded rather than an entity to be respected. They focused on the technique of obedience, the angle of the arm, and ignored the will, the content of the mind. The French proved that the most powerful form of resistance is often the preservation of internal moral sovereignty. The German failure to compel 40 million people to raise their hands was a strategic defeat more significant than the loss of a single battle. The historical impact of this defiance is clear. The refusal to bow, even in the smallest way, maintained the internal continuity of the French nation. It allowed them to emerge from the war not just as liberated, but as a people who had never truly surrendered. The true measure of a conquered people is not how they fight, but how they endure. And by refusing that one simple gesture, the French endured, preserving the moral foundation upon which their future republic would be built. This is the end of the narrative, a tale of psychological strategy, technological rigidity, and unbowed human will. This story is a testament to the fact that the quiet refusal of an ordinary citizen can hold as much strategic weight as the clash of armies, a victory won on the pavement, one unmoving hand at a time. If this detailed exploration of resistance, strategy, and human defiance resonated with you, please consider hitting the subscribe button. We are dedicated to uncovering the forgotten stories of courage that shaped our world. Which hidden history of Wawitu's psychological battles should we explore next?